"You're just a maid," the billionaire said, his voice cool enough to drain every ounce of warmth from the 37th floor boardroom. "Try not to confuse polishing the table with understanding what's on it." A ripple of restrained laughter circled the polished walnut conference table as Naomi Carter stood motionless beside a silver tray filled with crystal water glasses, her black housekeeping uniform perfectly pressed, her white gloves folded neatly behind her back, her eyes lowered the way years of invisible work had taught her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a bright October sky, sunlight bouncing off steel towers and pouring into the room like liquid gold. But inside, every face remained fixed on one document resting before William Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Capital. The agreement represented more than $1 billion, months of negotiations, and the future of thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the signature waiting at the bottom of page 37. Attorneys whispered to one another with quiet confidence. Executives adjusted expensive watches. Investment partners refreshed financial projections on glowing tablets. And no one noticed the woman standing silently near the coffee station except when they needed another refill. That was how people usually saw Naomi. She arrived before sunrise, left long after sunset, cleaned fingerprints from glass walls that reflected fortunes she would never own, and disappeared before anyone remembered her name. Invisible people learned to observe. They learned which executives smiled only when cameras were nearby, which assistants stayed late covering mistakes they never made, which lawyers carried confidence like armor, and which ones carried fear beneath tailored suits worth more than most monthly mortgages. Naomi noticed everything because nobody ever expected her to. William Harrington uncapped his fountain pen, its dark blue lacquer gleaming beneath the chandelier. "Let's finish this," he said, pushing the contract slightly closer. "We've wasted enough time already." Around him, heads nodded. Someone quietly congratulated another partner before the deal had even been completed. A young associate whispered that the market would love the announcement. The atmosphere shifted from cautious anticipation to quiet celebration. Naomi reached toward the table to replace an untouched glass of sparkling water when a single sentence caught her eye. She had not intended to read the contract. She had merely seen a familiar legal phrase positioned where it should never have been. Her fingers froze around the glass. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She read the sentence again, then a third time. The language looked harmless to anyone moving too quickly, buried beneath layers of technical wording and cross-references. But one clause quietly redirected every future liability away from one company and onto another. Whoever signed without catching it would inherit every lawsuit, every regulatory penalty, every undisclosed financial disaster hidden beneath polished presentations and confident smiles. Naomi felt the room growing strangely quiet inside her mind, even while conversations continued around her. William lifted the pen. Less than an inch separated its golden tip from the signature line. Naomi knew she should remain silent. She knew exactly what happened to employees who interrupted billion-dollar meetings. She knew no one would believe a maid over an entire legal department. Yet she also knew that once ink touched paper, the mistake could never be taken back. She drew one careful breath, lifted her eyes for the first time since entering the room, and spoke with calm certainty that seemed almost impossible for someone everyone had already decided did not belong there. "Mr. Harrington, please don't sign page 37. The words settled over the boardroom with a weight no one expected from someone wearing a housekeeping badge. For one suspended second, even the steady hum of the climate control seemed louder than anyone's breathing. William Harrington slowly turned toward Naomi, studying her with the detached expression of a man accustomed to deciding people's futures in a single conversation. Across the polished table, several attorneys exchanged puzzled glances before one of them leaned back with a faint smile that suggested amusement more than concern. Daniel Pierce, the company's chief financial officer, quietly folded his arms while Evelyn Brooks, the lead corporate attorney, narrowed her eyes at the page resting beneath William's hand. Nobody spoke immediately because nobody could quite understand why a housekeeper had interrupted a meeting that had consumed nearly 8 months of negotiations. Naomi remained exactly where she was, both hands lightly resting against the silver serving tray, her shoulders relaxed despite every pair of eyes now fixed upon her. She had spent years becoming invisible inside buildings like this one. Every evening after the executives disappeared behind private elevators, she wiped fingerprints from conference tables large enough to seat 30 people, emptied trash cans overflowing with confidential drafts, and polished windows that overlooked a skyline millions of tourists traveled across the world just to photograph. To everyone else, she was simply another employee wearing a Navy housekeeping uniform. They never wondered why she paused for a second whenever abandoned financial reports lay open across a table. They never questioned how she instinctively organized stacks of legal binders by subject instead of color. They assumed repetition had taught her efficiency. The truth was far more complicated. Years earlier, Naomi had been one semester away from completing her law degree before her mother suffered a severe stroke. Medical bills arrived faster than scholarships, and family came before ambition. She quietly packed away her textbooks, accepted the first stable job that offered health insurance, and promised herself that survival would come first while dreams waited patiently somewhere in the future. Every night after finishing work, she still read legal journals borrowed from the public library, highlighting recent court decisions inside notebooks already filled with careful handwriting. While other commuters watched movies during the subway ride home, Naomi studied contract law, securities regulations, and corporate liability because knowledge was the one possession life had never managed to take away from her. No one inside Harrington Capital knew any of this. To them, she was simply the woman who always remembered, who preferred sparkling water instead of still water, who quietly replaced burned-out light bulbs before anyone complained, and who somehow kept every executive floor spotless before sunrise. William continued watching her without speaking. His expensive fountain pen remained suspended above the signature line, while sunlight reflected against its polished barrel. Around him, confidence slowly began giving way to uncertainty. Evelyn Brooks finally reached toward the contract, her expression changing almost imperceptibly as curiosity replaced irritation. Naomi did not raise her voice or attempt to defend herself. She simply looked toward page 37 once more and spoke with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every difficult season of her life. "The liability language does not protect your company," she said softly. "It transfers every future legal responsibility directly onto Harrington Capital. If this agreement is signed exactly as written, your company will carry risks that the other side was supposed to keep." The room fell silent again, but this time nobody laughed. No one reached for a coffee cup anymore. No one checked a phone. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier dissolved into cautious silence as Evelyn Brooks slowly pulled the thick contract closer. The senior attorney adjusted her reading glasses, turned directly to page 37, and carefully followed the paragraph Naomi had indicated. At first, her expression remained composed, almost dismissive, but then her eyes stopped moving. She read the sentence again, tracing each line with the tip of her pen. The corners of her mouth tightened. Daniel Pierce noticed the subtle change before anyone else. He had worked beside Evelyn for nearly 15 years and knew exactly what that look meant. She had found something she did not expect. William Harrington watched both of them without speaking, his fingers still wrapped around the fountain pen that now rested silently above the contract instead of touching it. Sunlight drifted across the conference table as clouds passed beyond the windows, causing the room to brighten and dim almost like a slow heartbeat. The executives around the table exchanged uncertain glances, searching one another's faces for reassurance that never came. Naomi remained standing beside the serving cart, saying nothing further. She had already spoken the only words that mattered. Whether anyone believed her was no longer within her control. William finally broke the silence. "Evelyn," he said evenly, "tell me exactly what you are looking at." Evelyn did not answer immediately. She continued reading another page, then flipped back to the previous one before comparing two separate clauses that appeared almost identical. Finally, she exhaled quietly. "This is unusual," she admitted. "The wording in Section 12 appears standard, but the cross-reference redirects responsibility to an amended definition introduced later in the agreement." Daniel leaned forward. "Meaning?" Evelyn looked toward him without lifting her hand from the page. "Meaning the liability language changes after the definitions section. If someone only reviews the summary provisions, they would never notice it." Another attorney reached for his own copy, flipping rapidly through the document. Within seconds, several pages rustled around the room like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. Confidence gave way to concentration. William slowly placed his pen on the polished table instead of signing. The soft click echoed much louder than it should have inside the suddenly silent room. Across the video conference screen mounted on the wall, representatives from the opposing company waited patiently, unaware that the meeting had stopped moving forward. One executive quietly muted the audio while another whispered that they needed another few minutes. William ignored them completely. His attention never left the contract. "Show me," he said. Evelyn pointed directly at the paragraph Naomi had noticed. The language appears harmless until this definition changes the meaning of the responsible party. Once that happens, every future claim, including unknown liabilities, shifts here. Her finger rested on the Harrington Capital name printed. In bold type, Daniel's face lost its color. "That could expose us for years," he murmured. Evelyn gave a slow nod. "Potentially decades, depending on pending litigation we have not even seen yet." A heavy silence settled over everyone present. William lifted his eyes from the contract and looked across the room toward Naomi. For the first time since she had entered carrying a tray of water glasses, he was not looking at a housekeeper. He was looking at the one person who had seen what an entire room full of experienced professionals had missed. William Harrington rose slowly from his chair, not out of anger this time, but because sitting still no longer felt possible. He walked to the wall of windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, folded his hands behind his back, and stared at the endless stream of traffic moving far below. For nearly 30 years, he had trusted preparation over instinct, experts over assumptions, and contracts over promises. That discipline had built one of the most respected investment firms in the country. Yet today, a single overlooked sentence had nearly undone everything. Behind him, the conference room remained unnaturally quiet except for the soft turning of paper as attorneys continued reviewing every page from the beginning. Evelyn Brooks marked several paragraphs with a yellow pen before looking toward the large monitor where the opposing legal team still waited patiently. She pressed the mute button once again before speaking. "We need to suspend the signing immediately. There may be additional language connected to this clause." Daniel Pierce nodded without hesitation. "If there is one concealed transfer of liability, there could be others." William turned back toward the table. His expression was calm, but the confidence that had filled the room earlier had become something more careful. "How did we miss this?" he asked quietly. No one answered. Years of experience suddenly felt strangely fragile. The silence lingered until William looked directly at Naomi. "Come here, please." Every head turned again as Naomi carefully set the silver tray onto a nearby sideboard. She walked toward the conference table without rushing, her polished black shoes making almost no sound against the marble floor. Even now she carried herself with quiet humility, never assuming she belonged among executives earning more in a week than she earned in a year. William gently rotated the contract toward her. "Show us exactly what you saw." Naomi hesitated for only a moment before leaning slightly over the document. She did not touch the pages immediately. Instead, she read several lines aloud in a calm, measured voice, carefully emphasizing the legal definition that appeared ordinary by itself but changed meaning once combined with a later amendment. "This definition seems routine," she explained softly, "but the amendment on page 42 quietly changes who accepts future liabilities. Because of that change, this sentence no longer protects Harrington Capital. It obligates the company to absorb claims that belong to the seller." Evelyn compared both pages side by side. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "She is right," she admitted. "The amendment rewrites the earlier language without drawing attention to it." Another attorney quickly searched through previous draft versions stored on his laptop. Within moments, he looked up with visible surprise. This paragraph was added only 48 hours ago. It was not included in the version we approved last week. Daniel slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Someone expected us to rely on the executive summary instead of reading every revision." William remained silent as he absorbed the realization. Outside, sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers, filling the conference room with a bright afternoon glow that seemed almost at odds with the growing seriousness inside. Naomi stepped back respectfully after finishing her explanation, ready to return to her duties without asking for recognition. She had not spoken to impress anyone. She had spoken because allowing the mistake to happen would have betrayed everything she still believed about honesty, responsibility, and doing the right thing even when nobody expected it from someone wearing a housekeeping uniform. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted from uncertainty to urgency. Every copy of the agreement was now open, every attorney searching line by line for language that no longer deserved the benefit of the doubt. The celebration that had seemed inevitable only minutes earlier had vanished completely. William Harrington returned to his seat without saying a word, resting both hands on the polished table as he watched his legal team work with an intensity that should have existed from the beginning. Across the video screen, representatives from the opposing company remained politely composed, but one of them had begun quietly checking his watch. The unexpected delay was becoming difficult to ignore. Evelyn Brooks continued comparing revisions from earlier drafts, while Daniel Pierce requested every version exchanged during the final week of negotiations. Within moments, another attorney looked up from his laptop, his voice noticeably lower than before. "There is another revision," he said. "Not as serious as the first one, but it follows the same pattern. Small wording changes. Hidden inside ordinary language." Evelyn immediately reached for the document. Her eyes moved quickly across the screen before she slowly nodded. "Someone expected us to trust familiarity instead of precision." William leaned back in silence. He had spent decades reminding young executives that details determine success. Yet today, he had nearly become the victim of the very mistake he warned others never to make. He turned toward Naomi once more. She had quietly stepped back toward the serving cart, prepared to disappear into the background again, as though none of this involved her anymore. "Ms. Carter," William said calmly. Naomi stopped and faced him. "Yes, sir. How did you recognize it so quickly?" Every person in the room waited for her answer. Naomi hesitated, not because she feared the question, but because she had never expected to explain her past inside a room like this. "When I studied contract law," she answered softly, "my professor always said that dangerous clauses rarely look dangerous. They hide inside familiar language because that is where people stop paying attention." Several attorneys looked down at their own notes. None of them challenged her explanation. It made uncomfortable sense. Daniel studied Naomi carefully before asking, "You studied law?" Naomi gave a small nod. "I did. Why are you working here?" She smiled gently, although there was sadness behind it. "Life changed. My mother became ill before I finished school. She needed me more than my degree did." No one interrupted. Even the quiet sounds of keyboards had stopped. William lowered his eyes briefly toward the contract resting before him. For the first time that afternoon, the expensive paper no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. The legal team resumed reviewing every page, now asking Naomi occasional questions about sections that appeared unusually complex. She answered carefully, never pretending certainty where she did not have it, always distinguishing between what she knew and what she believed deserved another review. That quiet honesty impressed Evelyn more than any technical explanation. Nearly 40 minutes later, she finally closed the binder and released a slow breath. "There are 3 separate liability shifts," she said. "Had we signed this version today, Harrington Capital would have accepted obligations worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming years." No one celebrated discovering the truth. Instead, a respectful silence settled across the room as everyone understood how close they had come to making an irreversible mistake. William looked toward Naomi once again, but this time there was no trace of the distant superiority that had greeted her when she first entered carrying a tray of water glasses. There was only quiet reflection and the growing realization that wisdom had arrived wearing a uniform everyone else had been too proud to truly see. The conference room remained unusually still after Evelyn closed the final binder. No one rushed to speak because every person present understood that silence carried more weight than any explanation. Beyond the towering glass walls, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent over Manhattan, softening the sharp reflections of steel and concrete into warm shades of amber. Long beams of light stretched across the walnut table, touching the unsigned contract, the abandoned fountain pen, and finally Naomi's folded hands. She stood quietly beside the serving cart once again, exactly where she had begun the afternoon, as though nothing about her place in the room had changed. Yet everything had. William Harrington remained seated, looking not at the agreement, but at the sunlight resting across its pages. For the first time in many years, the numbers inside the document no longer occupied his thoughts. Instead, his mind returned to a sentence he had spoken less than an hour earlier, words delivered with certainty, confidence, and careless judgment. They echoed now with uncomfortable clarity, sounding far colder in memory than they ever had in the moment. Around the table, no one celebrated avoiding disaster. The legal team quietly organized their notes with unusual care, each page sliding into place with gentle whispers against polished leather folders. Daniel Pierce slowly removed the presentation from the large display screen, replacing financial projections with a blank company logo that glowed softly against the wall. The room, once driven by deadlines and ambition, now felt almost reflective. Naomi glanced toward the windows for only a moment. She had always loved this hour of the day. The city looked different as evening approached. Office lights gradually awakened one floor at a time, while golden sunlight lingered between buildings that had seemed so cold only hours before. During countless evenings spent cleaning executive offices, she had often paused for just a few quiet seconds to watch the changing skyline before returning to work. Those moments reminded her that every difficult day eventually surrendered to another sunset. She believed the same was true for people. Pride could soften. Hearts could change. That quiet belief had carried her through years when disappointment might easily have become bitterness. She never allowed it to. William noticed the peaceful expression on her face and found himself wondering how someone who had sacrificed so much could still carry such calm dignity. She had not demanded recognition. She had not reminded anyone that she had been dismissed only minutes before. She had not spoken with resentment even after proving an entire room of accomplished professionals wrong. She had simply done what conscience required and stepped back without expecting applause. The realization settled heavily inside him. Wealth had taught him how to build companies, negotiate impossible deals, and recognize financial opportunity within seconds. Yet somehow he had failed to recognize wisdom, standing only a few feet away because it arrived wearing a housekeeping uniform instead of an expensive suit. The distant sound of a fairy horn drifted through the insulated glass, faint but unmistakable, blending with the quiet rhythm of the city preparing for another evening. No one moved for several more seconds. The contract remained unsigned. The future of the company remained protected. And in the stillness between fading daylight and approaching evening, every person in that boardroom understood that the most valuable lesson of the day had never been hidden inside a billion-dollar agreement. It had been quietly carried into the room by the one person everyone had overlooked. William Harrington walked back to the head of the conference table with slow, deliberate steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. He rested both hands on the back of his chair, but did not sit. Instead, he looked toward the large video screen where the representatives from the other company still waited, expecting a signature that would never come. William pressed the microphone button. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with calm professionalism, "after a final internal review, Harrington Capital has identified several material inconsistencies within the current draft. We will not be executing this agreement today. Our legal department will return a revised version after every provision has been independently verified." The expressions on the other side of the screen changed almost instantly. Surprise appeared first, then visible discomfort. One attorney attempted to explain that the language reflected standard industry practice, but Evelyn Brooks responded before William needed to say another word. She carefully identified each altered clause, every revised definition, and every hidden transfer of liability that had been inserted during the final revision process. No one interrupted her. No one challenged her analysis. Within minutes, the opposing legal team quietly requested time to review the document again before ending the call. The monitor faded to black, leaving only the reflection of everyone still standing inside the boardroom. Daniel Pierce released a long breath he seemed to have been holding for nearly an hour. "We came within inches of signing away hundreds of millions of dollars," he said quietly. Evelyn slowly closed her notebook. "Not hundreds," she corrected. "If those future claims had matured over time, the total exposure could easily have exceeded $1 billion. Her words settled across the room like a final confirmation that no one could deny. William remained silent. He looked toward the unsigned contract, then toward Naomi. Every executive at the table followed his gaze. The woman who had entered carrying water glasses now stood under the warm glow of the evening sun, saying nothing, asking for nothing, waiting only for permission to continue the work she had been hired to do. William finally spoke, his voice noticeably different from the one that had greeted her earlier that afternoon. "Ms. Carter," he said, "would you remain here for a moment?" Naomi gave a respectful nod. The others quietly watched as William walked toward her instead of asking her to come to him. It was a small gesture, but everyone noticed it. He stopped only a few feet away. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. William glanced briefly at the housekeeping badge clipped neatly to her uniform before meeting her eyes again. "I built this company believing that talent could come from anywhere," he said softly. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped living by that belief." No one in the room looked away. William turned toward his executive team. "Today, every one of us witnessed something we should never forget. We trusted titles, offices, and expensive credentials. We nearly ignored the one person who actually protected this company." Evelyn gave a quiet nod of agreement. Daniel lowered his eyes, remembering how easily he had assumed Naomi did not belong in the discussion. The room that had once measured people by position and status now stood united by a single undeniable truth. The greatest act of leadership that afternoon had not come from the head of the table. It had come from the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let the truth remain hidden simply because no one expected someone like her to see it. The last traces of sunlight stretched across the boardroom as evening settled over the city, painting the glass towers outside with soft shades of gold and amber. One by one, the executives gathered their folders, but no one seemed eager to leave. The room that had begun the afternoon filled with confidence now carried something far more valuable: humility. William Harrington looked toward Naomi before quietly removing the identification badge that granted him unrestricted access to every executive floor in the building. He placed it beside the unsigned contract, almost as if reminding himself that titles meant very little without character. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "before anyone leaves this room, there is something I need to do." Naomi remained where she stood, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She had never imagined that the most powerful man in the company would speak to her with such sincerity. William took another step forward. "Earlier today, I judged you by your uniform instead of your ability. I assumed your job defined your value. I was wrong." His voice remained steady, but every word carried unmistakable honesty. "I owe you an apology, and I would like to offer it in front of everyone who heard my mistake." The boardroom became completely silent. No phones rang. No laptops closed. Every executive understood that they were witnessing something far rarer than a successful negotiation. They were watching a leader admit that pride had clouded his judgment. William continued, "You protected this company when the rest of us failed to see what was directly in front of us. Because of your courage, thousands of employees will continue working without ever knowing how close we came to making a devastating mistake. That kind of integrity deserves more than gratitude. It deserves respect." Naomi listened quietly before offering a warm, modest smile. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," she answered. "But I was only doing what I believed was right. Anyone who noticed the same problem should have spoken up." William gently shook his head. "Most people would have remained silent after being dismissed the way I dismissed you." Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but if I had stayed quiet, I would have carried that decision with me for the rest of my life. Losing a job would have been difficult. Losing my integrity would have been far worse." Those words settled deeply into every heart in the room. Evelyn Brooks quietly removed a business card from her portfolio and walked toward Naomi. "If you are willing," she said with genuine respect, "I would like to help you finish law school. Our legal department has relationships with several universities. Your talent belongs in this profession." Before Naomi could respond, William spoke once more. "Harrington Capital will cover every remaining dollar of your education, including tuition, books, examination fees, and anything else you need. When you graduate, there will be a place waiting for you here if you choose to accept it. Not because you saved a contract today, but because you have already demonstrated the judgment and integrity that cannot be taught in any classroom." Naomi felt her eyes fill with quiet emotion, yet she remained composed. "I accept your kindness," she said gently. But I hope everyone remembers that the most important thing that happened today was not that I found a mistake. It was that all of us were willing to stop, listen, and choose what was right before it was too late. No one applauded. No one felt the need. In the peaceful silence that followed, respect had already said everything words no longer needed to explain. 3 months later, the first light of a crisp January morning spilled across the glass facade of Harrington Capitol, turning the towering building into a mirror that reflected the awakening skyline of Manhattan. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and conversations about another busy day, but something had quietly changed inside the company. New training programs emphasized listening before judging. Hiring panels no longer focused only on prestigious resumes, but also on character, perseverance, and potential. William Harrington had personally rewritten several leadership policies, reminding every executive that respect was not a privilege reserved for titles, but a responsibility owed to every person who walked through the building's doors. Few outside the company knew why those changes had happened, and William never sought recognition for them. Some lessons were meant to transform people, not headlines. As the lobby filled with the gentle sounds of footsteps across polished stone, the elevator doors opened on the executive floor. Naomi Carter stepped out wearing a simple navy business suit instead of her housekeeping uniform. A leather portfolio rested comfortably in one hand, while a student identification card from her evening law program remained tucked safely inside her purse, a quiet reminder that dreams delayed were not dreams abandoned. She paused for only a second beside the wide windows overlooking the Hudson River. Winter sunlight shimmered across the water, brighter than she remembered, as though the city itself had become just a little warmer. She smiled softly before continuing down the hallway she had once cleaned every evening after everyone else had gone home. The familiar marble floors reflected her footsteps just as they always had, yet they somehow felt different beneath her feet. Doors that had once remained closed now opened before she reached them. People who had once hurried past without noticing her now greeted her by name. Not because she had become more valuable than before, but because they had finally learned to see the value that had always been there. William stood outside the legal department waiting quietly as she approached. He extended his hand with genuine respect, and Naomi accepted it with the same calm grace that had guided her from the beginning. Neither of them spoke immediately. Words seemed unnecessary. Around them, attorneys, assistants, analysts, and interns paused only briefly before returning to their work, each carrying the quiet memory of the afternoon that had reshaped the culture of the company. William finally smiled. "Welcome," he said simply. Naomi returned the smile. "Thank you." Nothing more needed to be said. She walked toward her new office, where an unopened notebook rested beside a single fountain pen waiting on the desk. Through the nearby window, sunlight settled gently across its polished surface, almost exactly as it had fallen across an unsigned contract months before. Naomi placed her portfolio beside the notebook, took one slow breath, and looked out over the city that had tested her courage without ever taking away her kindness. Far below, people hurried along crowded sidewalks, each carrying stories invisible to everyone around them. Naomi understood that better than most. She also understood something else. Real strength had never come from wealth, titles, or power. It came from choosing integrity when silence was easier, extending grace when resentment seemed justified, and believing that every human being deserved dignity before they had earned anyone's admiration. Outside, the winter wind carried golden morning light across the skyline, while inside the office, the quiet remained untouched. It was the kind of silence that did not follow victory or defeat. It followed understanding. And in that peaceful stillness, justice no longer needed to announce itself, because everyone who had witnessed the journey could already hear it.